مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الاسم الذي يشتهر به هو الحزب القديم الكبير، ولكنه في الواقع الأحداث بين الحزبين الرئيسيين في الولايات المتحدة. أشهر رؤساء الحزب كان إبراهام لينكولن، الرجل الذي حرر العبيد، وفي الحرب الأهلية هزم فكرة أن كل ولاية يفترض السماح لها بالانسحاب من اتحادنا الفيدرالي. ولكن الحزب يحتفي اليوم بفكرة أن الحكومة يجدر بها ألا تتدخل في قرارات الولايات، ولم يتلقى إلا حوالي 10% من أصوات الناخبين الأمريكيين السود. جزء من الحزب أراد زيادة الإنفاق العسكري لتكون دولة أقوى في الخارج، وجزء من الحزب أراد تقليص الإنفاق العسكري والتركيز فقط على الداخل. إنه يتحكم في كلا مجلسي الكونغرس، ولكن ماذا يريد فعلا؟ أتحدث بطبيعة الحال عن الحزب الجمهوري، واليوم في برنامج داخل واشنطن يسرني أن أناقش الوضع الحالي للحزب مع مايكل ستيل، الرئيس السابق للجنة الوطنية للحزب الجمهوري. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with Michael Steele, former chairman of the Republican National Committee. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here.
So these should be great days to be a Republican, are they?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. I think in some respects, yes, in the sense that when you're looking at the upcoming presidential races race, the number of candidates that are potentially in the race is very good. We have a very strong bench of candidates who can step out and run for the presidency as a governor, as a former senator, as a current senator. So that makes a difference. The real test is going to be what is the conversation they have with the American people, how the American people respond to that conversation. And it goes beyond ideology and really rests on whether or not you speak to me, whether or not you're saying something that resonates in my household, when it comes to taxes, how we spend our money, what our priorities are, questions of war and peace. All of these things are going to be big ticket items for families and households around the country over the next 18 months. And how the Republican candidates step into that conversation or have that conversation with the American people is going to matter.
So what would you define as the single biggest challenge facing your party?
Wow, there are a lot. I think some internal, some external. The internal challenges will be the ideological battles between and among conservatives and everyone else in the party. So you have conservatives who have drawn this litmus test line of how conservative you are. Then you have moderate Republicans who aren't, who may be socially more progressive, fiscally conservative. You have that battle. And so there's this internal struggle over identity, who we are, what we believe, why we believe it. And then again, going back to what I said before, how we express it. That's one battle. Then there's the external battle that goes to, how we engage a national conversation, which we've not done very well with our candidates in the past. You saw Mitt Romney get tripped up on the 47%, comment and his views on immigration and things like that. So there's also this national tension between the party and the American people and itself, really. How do you translate that on a national scale? So I think there's going to be some early challenges to get worked through. You have Ted Cruz, who's already stepped out and announced he's running, and who hopes to shape and sort of set in place the national conversation within the Republican Party, which he wants to be a very conservative conversation. Then you'll have Jeb Bush, when he announces, who will have a very different emphasis when he talks about education, Common Core, for example. He talks about immigration. So that's going to be, I think, a reflection of the tensions that you'll see.
And within the party itself, you've just described these internal tensions. Which stream, libertarian or national security defense or fiscal hawks, which stream do you think is in the ascendance right now?
Oh, without a doubt, I think it's the libertarian stream. I think, which is interesting because that really harkens back to the roots of the GOP. Its founding was really along this libertarian idea that was born out of the Whigs and and the abolitionist movement at the time that talked about respecting individual rights and liberties, respecting the freedom of individuals to make choices for themselves, to be fully American, to be a full citizen, if you will, with all the rights granted to you under the Constitution. That concept has taken great root within the party and is manifested in large measure by Rand Paul. Certainly it was manifested by his father, Ron Paul, Congressman Ron Paul. Didn't have the same level of traction back in the day when he was in the Congress and certainly running for president the last few times. But Rand has been able to sort of translate that and tap into that energy, which is driven in many respects by the 18 to 30-year-olds, the millennials, those young men and women who are beginning to find their own footing in politics. And I think that they will have a very important role to play in both parties, the libertarian aspects for the GOP and the progressive aspects for the Democrats, which is going to be Hillary Clinton's challenge as she deals with the Elizabeth Warren wing, if you will, the more progressive wing, particularly on fiscal issues, Wall Street, within the Democratic Party. And
can a libertarian message carry the Republicans to the White House?
That's the test. I think it can. I very much take ownership of my libertarian roots. Is partly why I call myself a Lincoln Republican. Yeah, I think it can. But again, you're talking about a shift for the party. And part of that shift goes back to what we were just talking about, dealing with that internal struggle, dealing with those internal frictions and fractions and factions within the party that make it more difficult for a new idea to emerge. You've got to deal with the soup you're in, the mess you're in right now, before you get to a better place. And I think that's part of what we're going to see played out in the early stages of the presidential primary.
I mean, it's been a long time since Republicans nominated the most conservative candidate.
Oh my goodness, yes.
They tend to nominate the more moderate candidates.
And that's an interesting, ironic point, because you would think that as conservative as the party propels itself out there, promotes itself to be, that they would nominate that conservative, but they haven't. And that's why I argue they should nominate the most conservative person they can. And there's a reason for that. And that is so you help settle the argument within the party that in doing so, you're now testing the proposition before the nation. And people will either buy what you're selling or they won't. And if they're not buying the most conservative candidate that you've now nominated to put out there, in other words, they don't elect them, Hillary Clinton wins, then that tells you you've got to step back from this argument and recognize, maybe that wasn't our problem all along, and that maybe we should be looking at this in a different way. And I hope that that's part of the resolution that comes this next year.
So when you say the most conservative candidate, have you already identified who your candidate is?
No, I haven't. And it's largely because I want the opportunity to sort of vet everyone.
Okay, we'll be back with more with Michael Steele, focusing on what it means to be a black Republican in 2015, in just a moment. Michael Steele is a major figure in the National Republican Party. A native of Maryland, he is an attorney by training, politician by profession, and Republican by choice. He was elected lieutenant governor of the state in 2002, making him the first African American ever elected to statewide office. Indeed, at the Republican National Convention in 2004, he delivered the official response to Barack Obama's first national speech at the Democratic Convention. Though he was defeated in a race for the U.S. Senate in 2006, Michael came back 3 years later to be elected chairman of the Republican National Committee, in essence, the chief of the Republican Party. Since then, he has remained a force in the party, arguing for inclusion of blacks and other minorities. He is also a highly sought political analyst and columnist on major television and print media outlets. Michael, you said earlier that you describe yourself as a Lincoln Republican.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, what it means for me, I think back to growing up here in Washington, D.C. And I remember at 17 years old making the decision that I would join the GOP, become a Republican. Didn't thrill my parents too much, who were both Democrats. They sort of scratched their heads. But as I expressed to them then that the Republican Party is the home, it's the political home for African Americans. It is where our political journey in this country began with great leaders like Frederick Douglass, who argued and moved President Lincoln to do things like the Emancipation Proclamation. That would then be a force later on and a champion of civil rights. And so we played a role in our own emancipation. We played a role in our own freedom, if you will. And that freedom rested in the hands of first abolitionists and then the Republican Party. So that's our political root. And for me, that mattered. It's always good to go home and to be at home. And I thought that to engage in a political dialogue, I didn't want to be one of a lot of people, one of many, standing on one side of the boat, if you will. Because if you're in a boat and everybody stands to one side, in a canoe, it tips over. You need to find that balance. And I wanted to be a part of the balance of in the conversation. So that was the motivation. And really, the Lincoln Republicanism deals with this idea of freedom, the freedom to choose, the freedom to engage, the freedom to reach out and touch the American dream as you define it, the freedom that rests in the Constitution, that those words, even though written, excluded African Americans, my party fought to include African Americans. And so that, when we talk about, freedom for all, I'm part of the all, and that resonates very much for me.
Ever have second thoughts since you turned 17 about that choice?
There are days. There are days I sit back and go, okay, I'm going to need another drink to do this because this is a little crazy. Yeah, absolutely. But what anchors me is that 17-year-old kid. Now, I will say this, and one of my great frustrations is why I'm so passionate and animated about where the Republican Party is today, is if that 17-year-old kid were looking at our party today, he more than likely would not join. Why? Because it's not welcoming. It is not inclusive. It is not engaging his intellect. It is not engaging his sense of freedom and that spirit. Yes, a lot of folks use the words, but it's not just your words. It's what you do. It's the actions you take. So when you're perceived and seen as a party that is prohibiting access to the ballot box, when you're seen as the party that is limiting my ability to engage in the franchise, to vote, that's a problem. And that's not Lincoln-esque. In fact, it goes counter to everything that Lincoln and those reformers and movers at the time stood for. And so my goal is to remind the party of that and to bring that narrative forward so you understand your history, and then propel yourselves into the future with that understanding to embrace everyone, accept people where you find them. Don't try to shape their lives and tell them, well, this is the kind of Republican you need to be in order to be a Republican. I don't want to hear that.
And do you think after the experience of having Barack Obama as president, that it's possible for the Republican Party to reclaim even a significant portion of African Americans to its ranks?
No, that's going to take some work. That's going to take some work. No, there has been a very deep alienation around this president between African Americans and the GOP. Deep alienation. When you literally start his term within the first week of his taking the oath of office with your single goal is to make him a one-term president, and those were the words of then minority leader, now majority leader Mitch McConnell, that sends a signal, and did send a signal. And then when you look at the ensuing conflicts and recriminations and ugly words that have passed between the GOP and this president, which day in and day out is taken very personally, because that's how we argue it. We've argued against this president in a personal way, not in a policy way. And that has not resonated well, and it's going to take a great work to undo some of that.
So if you were to give one very specific piece of advice to your party on this issue, what would it be?
Stop engaging this president personally. Stop making everything he does a personal affront to you, like he's taking food off your table or beating your children. We've so personalized the animus against him that it's unbecoming, and it's embarrassing, and it is not what we should do. As much as Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill and Newt Gingrich and President Clinton didn't like each other personally, they worked together for the good of the country, and they solved problems. We have stopped solving problems because there's money in throwing bombs. There's money in asking for the president's birth certificate. There's money in saying ugly things, ginning up the base on stuff that doesn't matter, as opposed to focusing their attention on the real consequences of public policy. And so that would be my advice. Shut the heck up about the president personally and focus on the substance of policy. You've got to tell the American people what you're going to do different and why. Not just because it's Barack Obama.
Now your party controls both houses of Congress. It has an opportunity to, in some sense, rebrand itself before the next election.
Yeah.
What advice would you be giving to party leaders, Speaker Boehner, Senator Mitch McConnell, about what they need to accomplish in the next year?
Okay, I'll be polite about this. Get your head out of the clouds and focus on the families of this country. Focus on our relationship with our global partners. Think about our enemies, foreign and domestic, and connect one to the other. Lay out a strategic plan, if you will, that deals with these three areas, that gives the people a sense that you've moved, now that you have control of both the House and the Senate, that you're prepared to govern, that you're prepared to govern the country, that you're prepared to deal with the sticky issues that we have to face as a nation. And that despite the differences you may have with the president, as we've just seen recently with the invitation of Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, coming to America, that the goal is not to embarrass the president, the goal is not to embarrass our country, the goal is not to score political points, but to actually to put us on a stronger footing domestically and globally. And that you have a plan to govern in these spheres. And we haven't shown that yet. We haven't shown that yet. And the clock is ticking. Now, what I suspect will happen, and that I hope will happen actually, is that out of this group of 20-some candidates who want to be president, that someone will emerge and have that moment of clarity within the party and direct the party in this new way, in saying, we're not doing this way anymore. We're not going down that road anymore, but this is the path forward. And as I look at the field, someone like a Rand Paul, I think, has that potential. A Jeb Bush has that potential, and he's made it clear. He says, I'm willing to lose the primary to win the general. And that says a lot to me. That means that you're willing to have that honest, authentic moment when you tell people in the party, we're not doing it that way anymore. We're doing it this way.
Michael Steele, thank you very much for joining us on داخل واشنطن. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، ويشمل ذلك مستقبل الحزب الجمهوري في انتخاباتنا الرئاسية القادمة، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.